As a tutor who has little to no experience in writing lab reports, this can all be overwhelming. Fortunately, there are many resources and strategies available that may help you be more confident in your ability to help students during their writing process. In this video, we will cover strategies to help you as a tutor understand the nature of a scientific lab report. You'll understand the universal expectations of written scientific lab reports, and you'll also gain editing techniques for scientific lab reports, as well as supportive resources that can guide both you and your student through the writing process. But before we begin, let's start off with a little trivia. Which of the following people would offer the best assistance to a student writing a scientific lab report? Could it be a technician, a research scientist, someone who has never written a lab report, or D, all of the above? If you chose answer D, you are absolutely correct. Now I know you may be thinking, how can someone who has never written a lab report help a student who is writing a lab report? I'm glad you asked that. One of the most important things to remember about writing lab reports is that lab reports are very specific. In fact, they should be so specific that someone who has never written a lab report or has no formal knowledge of what the experiment is about can replicate the same experiment. A lab report is a very detailed, structured document that outlines the process of a lab experiment. A lab report typically includes 7 key components. It includes the title page, the introduction, methods, results, discussion, conclusion, and references. And so the title page is pretty self-explanatory. It usually includes the title of the experiment or the lab report, and the title should be as short and specific as possible. The title page also typically includes information that the lab instructor may require each student to write, such as the appropriate lab section and the name of their lab partners. Okay, so our introduction. This section of the lab report is significant because it provides the audience with a brief description of the topic and the overall objectives of the experiment. And so without it, things can get pretty awkward and pretty weird because no one really knows what you're doing. So it's kind of awkward. And so the topic is best introduced by the use of technical definitions and reference information related to the topic of interest. And so it typically includes a hypothesis and references. And so in this example, we can easily identify the topic of this experiment. Notice how specific terms are introduced and supported by outside sources related to this topic. The writer didn't assume that the audience was familiar with the terminology, which is important. Okay, so in this example, we can clearly see that the objective is stated, and this leads us to discuss our hypothesis. And the hypothesis is generally included as it describes the predicted outcome of the experiment, and it can also be thought of as the thesis of the lab report. And so sometimes a hypothesis will present itself as a form of a question. As we see in this example, the hypothesis is in the form of a question. And so ultimately, the audience reviewing this section should have a thorough understanding of what the experiment will be about and why the experiment is important. Okay, so this section is our method section, and it's probably one of the most important because it explains how things happen. And so it includes step-by-step instructions on how the experiment was conducted, which typically includes the materials and methods that were used, and it also highlights any mathematical equations and formulas used during the experiment. And so most students will use lab notes or procedure outlines as a helpful guide. And it's important to remember that the pre-procedure outline may be somewhat different from how the experiment was actually conducted. For example, some students may use extra material or alternative methods throughout the lab. And so that's important to note and document that as well. Notice how this example includes exact measurements and the chronological order in which each step was performed. And so an audience member reviewing this section should be able to follow the instructions step by step and replicate the experiment. So you can imagine how things could easily go wrong if important details are left out of this section. Okay, so the results section will typically include a visual representation, which usually includes graphs, charts, tables, figures, etc. And it'll also include a very brief description of the experimental outcomes. Okay, so in this example, you can see that the results are represented in the form of the table. The results should always be clearly presented and easy to follow. Adding a brief description of the results adds significance to the results, and it pretty much helps your audience follow along a little easier. And it's important that the brief description is actually a brief description and not an interpretation, because you'll actually add that on to your discussion section. All right, so for our discussion, this section explains how accurately the predicted outcomes relate to the actual outcomes. And so here a lab report will include explanations as to why an experiment did not work out as expected. And it may also include suggestions about future procedures that may produce more successful results. Okay, so here's an example of what a discussion should look like in a lab report. Notice how the writer highlighted discrepancies in the experimental results, as well as recommendations for future procedures. Okay, now we'll talk about the conclusion. The conclusion relates the experimental outcome to the overall lab investigation, and it also briefly resurfaces the key findings, challenges, and it relates the results back to the original hypothesis. So the conclusion is pretty much self-explanatory. It just wraps everything up. And so here's an example of what a conclusion should look like in a scientific lab report. Okay, so just like any other style of writing, it is important to cite work and give credit to the work of others. So citation formatting in scientific lab reports may vary depending on the specific type of lab report. Some lab reports may use APA guidelines, and some lab reports may use citation formatting from the American Chemical Society. So here is an example of the American Chemical Society citation formatting. You can also refer back to the Purdue OWL website for assistance with citation formatting, or ask your student if their lab instructor has specific guidelines for referencing their work. Okay, so now you're ready to write a lab report. Well, maybe not, but you now have a general knowledge of what scientific lab reports typically look like. And so although there are only 7 sections of a lab report, they can really be several pages long. And so with that being said, you may not have time to go through every tedious detail of a lab report. And so for that reason, we will discuss some editing techniques that you as a tutor can use when a time constraint exists. And so these techniques can help to ensure that your tutoring session is productive and successful. Okay, so similar to tutoring other styles of writing, it's important to prioritize your time properly so that you can address the most important parts of the writing process of writing scientific lab reports. And so the first thing to address is the organization of the lab report. And so some of the things that you want to consider as you're looking over the student's lab report is you want to make sure that the lab report includes the appropriate sections. And so does the lab report include a title page? Does it include an introduction? Does it have a method section, a discussion, a conclusion, and a reference page? And then from there, you want to also consider, is the information within these sections properly placed? And so with that meaning, does the introduction look like an introduction? Or does the results section look like the results section? Or does it look more like a discussion? So those are things you want to consider as you're looking over the student's lab report. Okay, so next it's important to make sure that the lab report is specific. Remember that a lab report should leave no room for ambiguity. It's very detail oriented. So as you look through each section, do you have suspicion of missing information? Keep in mind that you may not be an expert in the experiment's topic of interest. However, if you have questions about the experiment's process, then that could mean the writing may be too ambiguous. And remember, we spoke earlier about the lab report being specific enough for anyone to follow along and replicate it. So it should be specific. And one way to do that is to make sure the writing avoids flowery language. So the ideas should be expressed in the lab report precisely and accurately. Also be sure to correct grammatical errors. As a tutor, this will probably be the easiest part of your job. Be sure to look through each section to check the sentence structure. Most sections of a scientific lab report are written in present tense. However, there are some sections such as the discussion and the method section which are written in past tense. Okay, next you'll want to check the formatting of the lab report. Some lab instructors will count off for specific formatting issues such as font size, spacing, visual representation of data, and other things. Ask the student for a grading rubric as a guidance for that particular lab report. Although the overall formatting standard is universal for most lab reports, some guidelines may vary. By the way, plagiarism is still a thing, even when writing lab reports, especially when writing lab reports. Be sure that the lab report includes proper citations for reference information. And remember that information is mostly referenced in the introduction and discussion section. And your student may have more specific questions about their lab reports, some in which you may not be able to confidently answer. So the information listed may be valuable resources for your student in your future tutoring sessions. So just check it out. I hope that the information provided in this video will provide you with the proper tools to assist any student with a scientific lab report. Remember, you don't have to be a research scientist or a lab technician to be helpful. Thanks for watching. Special thanks to the Office of Undergraduate Research at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. You guys were great. Thank you.